Hey, welcome back, everybody. We're going to continue on with our reading of Freemasonry and Catholicism by Max Heindel. And don't let the title fool you. This really is an esoteric and in-depth look at certain Bible passages. And it also gets to the root of the esoteric importance of both Freemasonry and the institution of Catholicism, which are antagonistic toward one another. But figured I better jump on, get some more of these readings done here, because I tend to, just the way my mind works, I tend to spread myself too thin in too many directions because I'm always trying to do more than I should. But okay, so we got part 7, the Philosopher's Stone, what it is and how it's made. Those who have studied the writings of the ancient alchemists have always been much mystified by what is said concerning the philosopher's stone and the process of transmuting the base metals into gold. These claims have naturally given rise to a great deal of vague speculation. From time to time, students have asked for a direct statement from the writer concerning this subject of paramount importance, and as we are standing upon the threshold of a new age, where this precious jewel with all its power will be evolved and possessed by a considerable number of people, we feel that it is important to divest the subject of all the mystery that surrounds it and speak in plain terms concerning the matter. Then all who really wish to take the trouble involved, for it involves arduous labor, nothing worth having is ever gained without cost, may know how to make for himself or herself this great gem. Okay, so let's just interject there. Alchemy is not just laboratory alchemy. It's not just trying to make lead into gold. It's not just taking plant material and heating it up and extracting the essential oils out of it and whatnot. I mean, any of these processes are a symbol of what alchemy truly is. The alchemists were doing experiments, and they would make legitimate findings, but the driving force in why they were doing all these experiments was truly to understand more about the human composition and its connection to God. That's really what they were trying to do. And through the process, they ended up discovering how the cosmos works, how everything comes into being, and then the steps that are needed to be taken to get on the proper path back up to the Godhead. We are taught in the beginning God created heaven and earth, the whole universe, in fact, and we understand that this great force expresses itself either as will or imagination. Now think of that. And we've got the left brain and the right brain. Will, Lucifer, imagination is the feminine side. So we've got male side, female side. Everything that deals with this science has male, female, and the product of the male-female union. It really is that simple. It's that process repeated over and over and over again, and sometimes certain positions in that process will take on different names, and that kind of confuses the process a little bit. It confuses the understanding of it. But when we take it all the way back, if you've been following along in my dry erase board lessons, I walk through the Rosicrucian understanding of how our universe was created. Okay, and I've got entire lessons on that. So it's important to keep this in your mind, that everything really issues from a creative fiat, which is threefold in nature. And every natural thing has a threefold nature, just like we do. We have an astral body, an ether body, and our physical body. You could sum this up by, other ways to say it is like mind, body, and soul. We've all heard these, but keep that principle in mind. Okay, we are taught in the beginning that God created heaven and earth, the whole universe, in fact, and we understand that this great force expresses itself either as will or imagination. By imagination, the great architect of the universe must first have visualized everything as it is now, or as it was first created, and then by his will, the physical atoms were marshaled into the matrix of thought, thus gradually bringing the universe into manifestation, as designated by its creator. Nor is this process complete, but will continue until the whole has become perfect as originally designed. The divine hierarchies who have carried out the plan of the great Creator also use the same dual creative force when fashioning the crystal in the mineral, the leaf of the plant, or the shape of the animal. Their powerful imagination pictures in the archetypal region of the earth that which they desire to create, and their concentrated will molds the coarser matter into this matrix until it assumes a definite physical form as desired. How we can kind of think of this is, this is why it's important to have an understanding of ancient languages and stuff like that, because it'll tell you something. So essentially what Heindel is describing there is the pattern of the male being impressed upon the material of the female. And if we go back and break down the word father and mother, it really takes us back to pattern and matter. Because if you go back to Latin, pater is father, and mater is mother. And pater is the pattern which impresses itself on matter, if you want to think of it that way. Because that is, that's the correct way to think of it. It's the pattern which impresses its stamp on matter, giving it form. Pater and mater, father and mother. Man, the spirit, has a like creative power, and has through ages, under the guidance of God, learned to build bodies of increasing value as instruments for his expression. But his pilgrimage through matter was undertaken for the purpose of making him an independent creative intelligence, and to attain that end, it was necessary that he should be, at the proper time, emancipated from the guardianship of the gods, so that he might learn to create, not only for himself, but also to aid and to teach others in the great school of life. During the course of his evolution, man has become more and more enlightened concerning the mystery of life. But nevertheless, it is only a few hundred years ago when liberty and life were endangered by the expression of opinions in advance of the commonly accepted views, and it was for that reason the alchemists, who had studied more deeply than the majority, were forced to embody their teachings in highly allegorical and symbolical language. Their teaching concerned the spiritual evolution of man, and the terms salt, sulfur, and mercury, and azoth. Let me just interject. Azoth is that fifth element, the quintessence. Okay, just so we know what's being said there. Their teaching concerning the spiritual evolution of man and the terms salt, sulfur, and mercury, and azoth, so mystifying to the masses, were nevertheless rooted in cosmic truths, highly illuminating to the initiate. The students of the Rosicrucian teachings who have learned how the world came into being and the process of gradual creation should have no difficulty in properly understanding every part of their language. We know in the first place that there was a time when man in the making was a hermaphrodite, male-female, and able to create from himself. And we remember also that at a time he was like a plant in other respects. His consciousness was as that which we possess in dreamless sleep, and which is possessed by the plant. The vital energy which he absorbed into his body was used solely for the purpose of growing until the time of propagation came, when a new budding body was cast off to grow also. There was no incentive to action, and if there had been, man would have no mind or will to direct it. Okay, so that's going to throw some people off. I know those who are already in the know about some of this stuff understand what's being said there. But we tend to try to think within our recent history when they say hermaphrodite and all that, and it's like, no, we got to go epochs back for this. This is like when we didn't even have anywhere near the type of consciousness that we have right now. We lived in almost like a dream fantasy state, and that's when we were male and female both. And if that sounds kind of strange to people, well, modern science even proves that, up until a certain point, we possess both faculties, like in the embryo. We are both male female at a certain point, and then as the embryo evolves, it eventually projects one or the other as its dominant force. So, think of it this way. Your reproductive organs, obviously in the male it's the testicles, but in the female, they become the ovaries and whatnot. And if you just think about that a little longer, you can identify which parts become which parts and all that. But we don't really need to get into that right now. But it's a good thing to do the mind experiment with, because studying embryology can give us such insights into other areas of life, since the pattern follows. It's the same pattern. Okay. For the emancipation of humanity from this negative condition, one half of the creative force was subverted under the direction of the angels for the purpose of building a larynx and a brain. The man might learn to create by thought, as do the divine hierarchies, and express the creative thought in words. Thus man ceased to be physically hermaphrodite and became unisexual. He can no longer create from himself physically, as do the hermaphrodite plants, or psychically, as do the Elohim, the male-female hierarchs, in whose image he was originally made. And thus he occupies at the present time an unbelievable intermediate position between the plant and the God. And at the time when one half of the human sex force was diverted for the purpose of building the brain, men were helpless and lacking in knowledge of how to overcome the conditions. They did not even have the consciousness to know that there was a difficulty, and had no outside help been given, the race must have died out. Therefore the angels from the moon, who were the guardians of mankind, herded the sex together in great temples at times when the interplanetary lines of force were propitious to propagation, and thus they perpetuated their race. It was also proposed that when the brain had been completed by the lords of Mercury, elder brothers of our present humanity who excelled in intelligence should teach us how to use the mind and make it truly creative, so that we would no longer be dependent upon the unisexual process of generation now in vogue. Thus, by the work of these two great hierarchs, we were to be raised from unconsciousness to the first stage of creative intelligence, from plant to God. We have also learned that this plan was frustrated by the Lucifer spirits, stragglers from the moon period, who live upon the planet Mars. They needed a physical field of action, but were unable to create themselves. Hence, for selfish reasons, they taught humanity how, by cooperation of the sexes, a new body may be created at any time. In order to give an incentive, they instilled into mankind the animalistic, passionate nature which we now possess. Thus, to the ancient alchemists, the angels from the moon, which rules the saline tides of the sea, became synonymous with the element salt. They had found that a certain amount of salt in the blood is necessary to the mental process. Also, that excess of salt in the blood produces insanity, as best proven by the experience of shipwrecked sailors who become lunatics when they drink water containing the lunar element salt. They also established a connection between the moon and the mind. And yes, that is why we call people lunatics, because the moon is Luna. And here's another interesting point. When you look into the religious doctrines of the prophet Mani, who Rudolf Steiner talks about a lot, he started Manichaeism, but he's Mani. And think of lunatic, and then why we also say the word maniac. Well, it's like a lunatic, but it's got its root in the positive expression, the sun. Mani is a light religion, and so a maniac is someone possessed by too much solar energy. Let's continue. The fiery spirits who have taken such noxious part in man's evolution became associated with the fiery element sulfur. They said that as man is rendered unconscious and dies by continuous inhalation of this element, so man the spirit was rendered unconscious of the dead, or unconscious of and dead to the spiritual realms by the teachings which were instilled into him by the Lucifer spirits. Yes, it was the Lucifer spirits, which they call the angels of death. But in this sense, death means physical life. So what we call life in this physical body is actually death, because we're spiritual beings. The body is the sepulcher of the soul. The angels of death really are the ones who gave us this life. So that's important to know. The metal mercury, they contended, was the most elusive of all metals. It will penetrate and evaporate through most substances with which it is brought in contact, and therefore they likened it to the lords of Mercury, who are past masters in penetrating the secrets of nature by the mind, and capable of freeing the spirit from its physical prison house. By the process of generation carried on at a propitious time under the guidance of the angels, man was treading the path from plant to God, following the highway of evolution as originally planned. From this path, he strayed into the byway of degeneration, led by the Lucifer spirits, and is therefore now, as it were, in a slough, from where he cannot extricate himself, save with the help of others further advanced than he. When this becomes apparent to him, and he starts to search for the light, he stands at the pathway of regeneration, guarded by the Lords of Mercy, who with their wisdom will guide him toward the desired goal, and the method of this process, as outlined by the ancient alchemists, we shall discuss when we have summed up in a few words the points made. These must be firmly fixed in the mind to appreciate the full value of what follows. And in my lesson there, in my esoteric lesson that I gave on the dry erase board, what did I say? Okay, we go back to, it just said, the evolutionary path is guarded, right? It's guarded. That's the sword, the flaming sword in Genesis, which guards the tree of life. And I cover that in my dry erase board lessons, which there's a playlist of on my channel if anybody's interested. The creative forces used by God to bring a solar system into manifestation, and the force used by the divine hierarchies to form the physical vehicle of the lower kingdom over which they rule as group spirits, expresses itself in a dual manner, as will and imagination, and is the same as the united creative force of males and females which results in the creation of a human being. At one time, man was bisexual, male-female, and therefore each was able to propagate his species without the assistance from anyone else. But one half of the creative force has been temporarily diverted upwards to build a brain and larynx in order to enable him sometime to create by his own mind, to form thoughts and speak the word of power that shall make his thoughts flesh. 3 Great creative hierarchies were particularly concerned in bringing about this change. The angels from the moon, the Mercurians, and the Lucifer spirits from Mars. The alchemists connected the angels from the moon, which rules the saline tides, with the element salt, the Lucifer spirits from Mars with the element sulfur, and the Mercurians with the metal mercury. They used this symbolic presentation partly because of the religious intolerance which made it unsafe to promulgate any other teaching than that sanctioned by the Orthodox Church of the day, and partly because humanity as a whole was not ready to accept the truths which are embodied in their philosophy. They also spoke of a fourth element, Azoth. Okay, I'm going to correct myself here. I guess maybe I was wrong about Azoth being the fifth element. I could have swore that I read that, though. Okay, not important now. They also speak of a fourth element, Azoth, a name composed of the first and last letters of our original or of our classical languages, and intended to convey the same idea as Alpha and Omega, that of all-inclusiveness. This referred to what we now know as the spiritual ray of Neptune, which is the octave of Mercury and sublimated essence of spiritual power. The alchemists knew that the moral and physical nature of man had become gross and coarse on account of the passions inculcated by the Lucifer spirits, and that, therefore, a process of distillation and refinement was necessary to eliminate these characteristics and elevate man to the sublime heights, where the splendor of the spirit is no longer obscured by the coarse coating which now hides it from view. They therefore regarded the body as a laboratory and spoke of the spiritual processes in chemical terms. They noted that these processes have their inception and their particular field of activity in the spinal cord that forms the link between the two creative organs, the brain, which is the field of operation for the intellectual Mercurians, and the genitals, which is the vantage ground of the sensuous and passionate Lucifer spirits. This tripartite spinal cord was to them the crucible of consciousness, for they knew that in the sympathetic section of the cord which governs the functions that have to do particularly with the upkeep and welfare of the body, the lunar angels were specially active, and this segment was therefore designated as the element salt. The segment governing the motor nerves, which expended the dynamic energy stored in the body by our food, they saw clearly to be under the dominance of the martial Lucifer spirits, and they, therefore, named that segment sulfur, and the remaining segment, which marks and registers the sensations carried by the nerves, was named mercury, because it was said to be under the dominance of these spiritual beings. The spinal canal, contrary to the ideas of anatomists, is not filled with fluid, but with a gas that is like steam, in that it may be condensed when exposed to the outside atmosphere, but may also be superheated by the vibratory motion of the spirit to such an extent that it becomes a brilliant and luminous fire, the fire of purification and regeneration. This is the field of action of the great spiritual hierarchy from Neptune, and is designated Azoth by the alchemists. But this spiritual fire is not alike in every man, nor is it as luminous in one as in another. The state therefore depends upon the spiritual advancement of the person in question. I'm just going to stop right there and just contemplate this for a minute, because I know I've seen somewhere them call Azoth the fifth element. I'm almost positive. I could be making a mistake. But I think where he might be going with this is that sometimes you see things broken down into fours, and Azoth would be the top of that quad way of doing it. He might provide more clarity as we go. When the aspirant to the higher life had been instructed in these mysteries of symbolism, and the time had come to speak to him plainly, the following teachings were communicated to him, not in the same words or in the same manner, but at any rate he was given to understand, and it was made clear to his inner conscience that anatomically man belongs to the animals. Below that kingdom in the scale of evolution are the plants. They are pure and innocent, and their propagative powers or practices are untainted by passion. Their whole creative force is turned upwards towards the light, where it manifests as the flower, as a thing of joy and beauty for all to behold. Yet the plants are unable to do otherwise. They have no intelligence, no consciousness of the outside world, and no free will in action. They can only create in the physical world, however. Above man in the scale of evolution are the gods, creators upon the spiritual and physical plane. They also are pure as the plants, for their whole creative force is also turned upwards, and is expended in whatever manner their intelligence directs, and knowing good and evil, they always do good by choice. Between the gods and the plant kingdom stands man, a being endowed with intelligence, creative power, and free will to use it for good or ill. At present, however, he is dominated by the passion instilled by the Lucifer spirits, and sends one half of the creative force downward from the light to gratify his senses. In his innermost soul, he realizes that this is wrong, and hence he hides his creative instinct as a shame, and is outraged when it is dragged into the light. This condition must be altered ere spiritual progress can be accomplished, and therefore you must carefully consider the similarity between the chaste plant and the pure spiritual gods, who both turn their whole creative power upwards towards the light. In the course of evolution, you have risen above the plant, which has only creative power in the physical world, and have become like the gods, possessing the creative power on both the mental and physical planes of being, besides intelligence and free will to direct it. This was accomplished by the diversion of one half of your sex force upwards for building of a brain and larynx, organs which are still fed and nourished by this uplifting half of the sex force. But while the gods direct their whole creative force to altruistic purposes by the power of the mind, you still squander one half of your divine heritage upon desire and self-gratification. If therefore you would become as they, you must learn to turn your whole creative energy upward to be used under the direction of your intelligence entirely. And here's where the idea of abstaining from sex and using that sexual energy that you would expend on animalistic desires, instead transmuting that sexual energy into spinal fire and a fire in your brain, and using the intellect towards altruistic goals and denying the lower passions any type of satisfaction. Okay, that's what he's talking about there. Thus, only can you become as the gods and create from yourself by the power of your mind and the great word whereby you may speak the creative fiat. Remember that physically you were once hermaphrodite like the plant and able to create from yourself. Look into the future now through the perspective of the past and realize that your present unisexual condition is only a temporary phase of evolution, and that in the future this whole creative force must be turned upward so that you become a hermaphrodite spiritually, and thus able to objectify your ideas and speak the living word which shall endue them with life and make them vibrant with vital energy. This dual creative force, thus expressed through the brain and larynx, is the elixir vitae, which springs from the living stone of the spiritual hermaphrodite philosopher, and the alchemical process of kindling and lifting it is accomplished in the spinal cord where the salt, sulfur, mercury, and azoth are found. It is generated and raised into incandescence by high and noble thought, by meditation upon spiritual subjects, and by unselfish altruism expressed in daily life. The second half of the creative energy, thus drawn upward through the spinal canal, is a spinal spirit fire, the serpent of wisdom. Gradually it is raised higher and higher, and when it reaches the pituitary body and the pineal gland in the brain, it sets them to vibrating, opening up the spiritual worlds and enabling man to commune with the gods. Then this fire radiates and permeates the whole body, and its auric atmosphere in man has become a living stone, whose luster surpasses that of the diamond or the ruby. He is then the philosopher's stone. But to go back first, you must start with the first philosopher's stone, which is the three fused bones of your lower spinal column. That's where that unrefined spirit fire lays. That's the coiled up Kundalini serpent, which has not raised yet. Okay? And they call this the stone of scone sometimes. But that's the three fused vertebrae at the bottom of your spine. There were many other symbols and similes taken from the word of chemistry and applied to the processes of spiritual growth, which eventually makes us men living stones in the temple of God. But enough has been said in the foregoing to show what was meant by the ancient alchemists and the reason why they clothed their teachings in such symbolic language. The way is, however, and has always been open to anyone who really and truly seeks for enlightenment and is willing to pay the price in the coin of self-denial and self-sacrifice. Therefore, seek the temple door, and you shall find it. Knock, and it shall be opened to you. If you seek prayerfully, if you knock diligently, and if you labor manfully, you will in time reach the goal, and you will become the philosopher's stone. And again, I'm just going to interject here because people don't want to hear that one of the main keys to spiritual enlightenment, one of the it's like the base thing, is self-control and altruistic action. People want to take all these shortcuts and be like, no, you can just, you can do this little exercise and it'll activate your third eye. Well, I'm not saying those exercises don't also pertain to the process, but there's no shortcuts in spiritual evolution. I'm sorry, there's just not. There's no shortcuts. If you're unwilling to sacrifice your desires and all the lower elements of yourself, then, you're not going to get there. And that's just the fact. And people don't want to hear that because they want shortcuts. But there's no shortcuts. This is called the great work for a reason, because it actually takes work. All right, on to the next little part. Celibacy and marriage. In order to avoid misunderstanding, it should be said that this lesson was only given to the aspirant to discipleship to show him the reason why it's necessary for him to live a pure and chaste life. It does not apply to the masses who have no spiritual aspirations and are as yet unable to restrain their passions. The Rosicrucians do not even advocate an entirely celibate life for their pupils. Indeed, they regard it as a religious duty for the enlightened mystic, man and woman, to wed a kindred spirit, if such can be found, and thus furnish incoming souls a particularly advantageous opportunity for rebirth. When such a devoted couple performs the generative act in a spirit of aspiration to serve a waiting ego, when the prenatal conditions are pure mentally, morally, and physically, when the early childhood days of the ego thus born are spent in a home atmosphere of high and noble thought, both parents and children are making wonderful progress and as great souls cannot be born to ignoble parents any more than water can sink below its level. It would, indeed, be very wrong for aspirants to discipleship to live an entirely celibate life for the sake of self-advancement when conditions permit them to wed. Furthermore, the few times in a life when the creative force is legitimately required for propagation would not seriously interfere with the spiritual development undertaken to become the philosopher's stone, and the soul growth gained by assuming the duties of parenthood would far outweigh any possible loss. What the Rosicrucians teach, then, is that marriage between people who will restrain their use of the creative function to the purpose of propagation is eminently good, noble, and productive of great soul growth, but that unmarried aspirants should live an absolutely celibate life if they wish to attain the highest. And that's going to do it for that chapter. Next up, we got chapter 8, the path of initiation. And we might go ahead and knock that one out here in a little bit. So we'll be looking for that. Also be looking, if you're interested, this stuff's not for everybody, obviously. But if you are a person that's interested, I have created some dry erase board lectures that you might find interesting. And it goes right along with the teachings. So it's up to you what you want to do with that. If you feel like sharing it with people who are also seeking this knowledge, go ahead and do that. And that's going to be it for this chapter. We'll talk to you guys later. Thanks.